You're about to enter a world few ever see. A world where what you think is music hides a darker rhythm, where melodies don't just move your feet, but whisper to your mind. Is the music industry a harmless mix of glitz and glamour, or rather a portal to occult rituals, mind control experiments, and deep rooted social engineering? Let's turn up the volume here on Things Visible and Invisible. Mark, the last time we spoke, you really began to tantalize us with some ideas that we may have misunderstood the last 60 odd years in terms of popular entertainment, that it wasn't all just about fun and about young people being young people, but actually that behind the scenes there were kind of puppet masters pulling strings with an agenda. You talked about Elvis Presley and you talked about his manager, inverted commas, handler, Colonel Tom Parker. Let's move it a little bit more into the UK scene. We're both in the UK at the moment. Because you got me thinking about the Beatles. The Beatles and Elvis have similar sort of backstories. As you said, it's a Cinderella story, rags to riches, poverty to fame that they could never have dreamed of. I mean, are we to believe that the Beatles were also part of some kind of nefarious scheme?
Well, they were. And if anyone thinks that artists like Elvis Presley and the Beatles rise to the lofty heights that they achieved purely under their own steam, try it. Have a go. Form a band and see how far you get without signing over to one of these major corporations or one of these key manager/handlers. So the Beatles, according to many researchers, were a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. And this is the major social engineering think tank in the world, seemingly, which specialise in psychological operations. So they employ behavioural scientists and psychologists and anthropologists whose full-time job it is to work out how the human psyche operates and therefore how it can be manipulated and coerced. And this is a military grade operation. So Tavistock is connected to British military intelligence, an expression of the government. And where you find that, you often find entertainment because the things go hand in hand with each other. Another arm of it is the BBC. And it's interesting that George Martin, the Beatles' famous producer, known as the fifth Beatle, Sir George Martin, prior to becoming EMI's in-house producer and being given over to the Beatles to work with them on their key albums, worked at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And this is an organisation concerned with sonic manipulation, what can be achieved by tinkering around with sound. So it's through the Radiophonic Workshop that we got the very distinctive early theme tune to Doctor Who with that eerie kind of oscillator. That was a great example of the sort of stuff they were producing at the workshop. So then George Martin becomes the Beatles' producer. We know the rags to riches story of the Beatles, but there's a lot of aspects of them which don't normally get discussed. And one thing which mainstream commentators tend not to discuss that much is that the Beatles were effectively two bands, or they had two very distinct eras. So when they first came out, in 1962 with their first hit single, Love Me Do, they were effectively a boy meets girl boy band. Nice, pleasant love songs. She Loves You, Want to Hold Your Hand. By the time 1966 has come around, they've started to get very experimental with their sounds. Tomorrow Never Knows. And then the following year, 1967, known as The Summer of Love, which is a classical master study in the art of social engineering. The changing of societal attitudes to everything, to music, to drugs, to family, to sex, to all points in between. It had really kicked into overdrive by the time the Beatles came out with Sgt. Pepper in early summer 1967. By that point, they'd become very psychedelic, very trippy, very experimental. They'd also become a studio-only band. So the Beatles played their last ever official gig on the 29th of August 1966, Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They only played one other gig beyond that, which was the rooftop one in London for Let It Be, which doesn't really count because it was on a roof. So other than that, they'd become an album-only band. So they were putting out all this amazing sound, which was being curated by Sir George Martin. But nobody actually saw any of this stuff being produced. So we don't actually know that it was just the Beatles themselves that were producing all this amazing stuff, or if there were other parties, other musicians that had been brought in to work on this stuff. There's a researcher by the name of Mike Williams, who's known as Sage of Quay, and he's put out a ton of research to demonstrate that the Beatles cannot possibly have written all the songs that they've been credited with during a particular period in 1965 for the Rubber Soul album. It's just impossible because they were doing too much and the album was produced too quickly. So if we can demonstrate that that's the case for that one period in 1965, and we can, with evidence, with proof, then isn't it likely that that would have been the case in other periods during the Beatles' history? So if we're prepared to accept that, we have to accept that Lennon and McCartney did not write all the songs that they're said to have done. Several hundred songs from these couple of young lads who were also touring and doing interviews and had a family life to maintain. There just wasn't time for it all to be done. And I know it's hard for people to have to come to terms with this because we all love the mythical status of the Beatles that's been sold to us. It's a wonderful story, but is it an accurate one? And if we really are prepared to scrutinize what we're being presented with and examine the detail, we have to conclude that we've been sold a pack of lies, unfortunately, with this group. Well, and again, if that's the case with this group, it's going to be the case with many others.
Well, that's at the heart of what you're suggesting, Mark. Really, that it's a kind of Alice in Wonderland type retrospective, that everything that we thought was good is not good. Everything that it's dark as opposed to light. It's something which is evil as opposed to something which is good. Something which is not as wholesome as the early days of the Beatles were being promoted to us. However, the researcher that you mentioned there, whose work is all over the internet, is very clear that there was some kind of playing around with the various personalities in the band, that the band was a construct, if you like, the Beatles, that is, and that the Paul is dead legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, is actually something which demonstrates his thesis that this was all part of a grander plan. Where do you sort of stand in that realm? Do you actually think that the Beatles were who they said they were, and did they remain who they were throughout the tenure of the band?
For many people, the suggestion that the original Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter who's been playing the public role ever since is absolutely preposterous. And of course, when you first hear the suggestion, it sounds absolutely preposterous. But I cannot count the amount of subject areas that when I first came across them, they sounded preposterous to me. But when I started to actually be diligent enough to do the research, I came to discover that it's not preposterous at all. Where I stand on that whole thing is I can't prove that the original Paul McCartney died in 1966 or at any point since. What I can prove is that there have been at least two individuals playing the public role of Paul McCartney. And to get to this conclusion, all we need to do is apply the scientific method. All we need to do is trust our five senses. All we need to do is scrutinize the photographic evidence and the film footage that's available to us. And there's no shortage of that. And if we do that and we compare images side by side and we compare things like height, forensic detail, facial structure, voice prints, we have to come to the conclusion that there's more than one guy passing himself off as Paul McCartney there. The only way that could ever be achieved and gotten away with is if the Beatles were working in conjunction with military intelligence operations, because you can't fake somebody's death or get rid of somebody and replace them without it being discovered by these institutions. That's their job. So if you can prove that somebody has been replaced, but they've not been called out on it, and there's been no public acknowledgement of it, you have to conclude this is a military grade operation. And that is the case with the Beatles. Unfortunately, they were assets of the military industrial complex. I do want to make an important point here, though, because a lot of people find it very soul destroying to have to face up to these sad truths. And like I said earlier, I wish it was some other way. But this doesn't mean you have to throw out all your old music. It doesn't mean you have to tarnish and demonize these bands in your mind and have nothing to do with them anymore. You can, if you choose, continue to enjoy the music. The music is, after all, great, regardless of who may have produced it or the circumstances in which it was produced. I have a lot of people say to me, thanks a lot for destroying that band for me. There's another one I've got to throw out now. Well, you don't have to. All that's happened is that you've got the information out of the subconscious mind where it could have been having a controlling effect on you, and you brought it through into the conscious mind. Now, you know a bit about where this band most likely came from, what the agendas were that they were most likely pushing, some of the unsavory affiliations and connections that they may have had, some of the families that they may have come out of. Now you can better comprehend this, you can process it. The magic spell has been broken. The mind control is no longer going to be controlling you the way it perhaps once did. And that's actually something to be celebrated because you're not being mugged off anymore. You're not being made a fool of. Now you've got the opportunity to make a conscious decision for yourself whether you're going to continue to enjoy the music for the music's sake or whether you're going to throw it all in the bin. And that's a choice people have, to be able to make for themselves.
Absolutely. Mark, let's go back to the 1960s and in this country, if we just stick with that for the moment, what you've talked about, Tavistock Institute, various government agencies, the Beatles. I mean, the image we have, today, for example, we're used to conspiracies, we're used to big government and understanding that governments aren't as they appear to be in some instances. The 1960s, for most of us of a certain generation, appear to be a kind of much more innocent period. Now, there was the Cold War, obviously, at the time, and governments are governments and all the rest of it. But from your research, the level of sophistication that would have been necessary to pass this off, to take four young men from Liverpool and turn them into the biggest musical act on the planet for an agenda which has nothing to do with music. I mean, that's quite an ask, right?
It demonstrates how all these different facets of organised society are intrinsically linked. So the music business is working in conjunction with the film business, with the television industry, with the mainstream media, with academia, with medicine, with science, with government, with big business. Because what was happening in the 60s on both sides of the Atlantic was a major masterclass study in social engineering. They were taking the art form places it had never been before because it was encompassing every aspect of people's lives. It was aimed squarely at the young people at the time, the youthful generation, the generation known as the baby boomers, who were born towards the tail end of the Second World War and were just starting to come of age in the mid to late 1960s. So it's always the young people in any generation that they're trying to target, because once you get to a particular age, like my point in life, they don't bother with people of my age anymore. I'm too cynical and world-weary and grizzled for them to want to bother with. Whereas young hearts, minds and souls are so more easily malleable, and they're the ones that they want. So in the 50s, for example, which we spoke about last time, I mentioned Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock and Elvis Presley and all this stuff. And all of that change culture was aimed at the teenagers of the time, except that the word teenager was not in common parlance in the mid-1950s. It was invented for those times. And then if you go a decade or so later, you're in the 1960s. And over in California, you had the so-called counterculture, the sort of hippie flower power scene. The music was changing. It was getting trippy. It was getting psychedelic. There were drugs everywhere, not least LSD, which was the drug of choice on that particular scene. And so much documentation has proven that all that stuff was coming through CIA supply lines. The CIA, biggest pushers of drugs on the surface of Earth. And there were other compounds as well, mescaline and psilocybin mushrooms, and marijuana was getting pushed as well. But over in Britain, there was a counterpart to all of that. There was a British version of the Counterculture. It was aimed mainly at London and centred around London, and there were little pockets of it in Oxford and Cambridge coming out of the universities there. But you had bands which personified the psychedelic counterculture in London. One of them was Pink Floyd in its earliest iteration. They were known back then as the Pink Floyd, and they basically came out of Cambridge University. And most of the members of that group came from very wealthy aristocratic families. They were part of the establishment furniture. So in my view, they were inserted into the culture of the times to help push it in certain desired directions. There was LSD in London, all kinds of other drugs at that time as well. The music was changing. The Beatles played their part in that. So they went from She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Tomorrow Never Knows, Eastern mysticism and trippy psychedelic themes, not least on the Sgt. Pepper album. So you had the same cultural changes being driven in Britain and America at the same time. Now, that doesn't happen by accident. It does not happen in a grassroots organic fashion. It only ever happens in that way if the agencies in Britain and America are working in cahoots with each other with the same shared common aim. And like I said at the very start, entertainment, popular culture, and particularly music offer the perfect vehicles through which to get all that done. It's not really changed since the 60s, or well, the detail has changed, but the agenda has not really changed. Some people might think the 60s was a more innocent sort of era, but when you think about what was getting pushed in terms of societal norms in those times, what it all boiled down to was a breaking up of the traditional family unit, which had persisted largely in society up to that point. It was the encouragement of sexual promiscuity, experimentation with drugs, driving a wedge between the different generations in society, fomenting discord between the youthful generation of the time and their parents' generation and their value systems. So it was very chaotic and very destructive. And the ripples from what was done in the 1960s are still being felt today. And of course, they're still doing the social engineering. They've just changed the detail and they've wheeled out new assets to get the job done to new generations.
Mark, unfortunately, we have come to the end of this second episode with you. And again, I feel we're just getting started. And the more I listen to you, the more questions come into my mind. And you've started to answer them because I'm wondering what sort of agendas we're living through today here in this decade that we're in at the moment. But we'll have to come back to this if you could on another day. We'd love to have you back to talk some more about this. But for now, tell people where they can find out more about you, where they can pick up a copy of one of your many books.
So my main hub website is djmarkdevlin.com. And from there, you've got links through to my video platforms and my various podcasts and where you can find my books. You can get all of my books on Amazon. So that's Musical Truth Volumes 1, 2, and 3. The fourth volume is called No One's Dad's a Plumber. Maybe we'll get into the title of that next time. If you are outside of the UK, your best bet to get the books is probably via Amazon. I know not everyone likes Amazon, but it is the most efficient method to get them if you're overseas. If you're in the UK, I can mail out signed copies, and I do many talks around the UK. Every weekend, I'm out and about somewhere. So if you go on the events page on my website, you can find out where I'm going to be speaking live and maybe come along and get a copy of the book from there.
Mark, for now, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
No worries, mate. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.